The United States debt is increasing and creating political tensions, eroding growth, and compromising the institutional stability of the country, while different voices warn of the economic crisis that would unleash if an agreement is not reached in Congress that allows the debt ceiling to be raised, but only temporarily solving a complex problem that threatens the largest economy on the planet. The United States Constitution establishes that all loans requested by the government must be authorized by Congress. However, to gain flexibility, in 1917 a debt limit or ceiling was established to allow the United States Department of the Treasury to issue debt securities without permission from Congress, as long as this limit is met, but with the approval of its increase in the hands of Congress. This approval, when there is a period in which the president belongs to one party and one of the houses of Congress belongs to the other, usually generates a great drama that has always been resolved in favor of raising the debt ceiling, but in where the consequences of not doing so are so serious that they can cause enormous volatility in the market and institutional tensions between the three branches of government. And the debt of this country, which amounts to $31.4 trillion, thus exceeding the size of its own economy, which is $25.9 trillion, has grown so rapidly that it has gone from a size equivalent of 60% of its economy to more than 120% in the last 20 years. But how did the richest country in the world end up accumulating this level of debt? The answer is because of its fiscal deficit. Governments receive income mainly through tax collection and spend it on Social Security, infrastructure, and education programs, among many others. When revenues are greater than expenses, it is said that there is a fiscal surplus. When expenses are greater, there is a fiscal deficit, which forces the government to borrow to make up the difference. And as you can imagine, regardless of whether the administration is Democrat or Republican, politicians are happy spending. And the last time the government ran a surplus was more than 20 years ago, because virtually every president has increased government spending at a faster rate than revenue, making it necessary to take on debt. But how does this debt work? The government issues debt securities or bonds, people and institutions buy them, and the government agrees to return the principal plus interest. When there is a lot of demand for these bonds, the interest rate they have to pay is lower, and when there is less demand, the rate they have to pay is higher. And because it is the largest economy in the world, these bonds are considered risk-free and usually have very low interest rates and high demand. This has made it very easy for this country to continue increasing its spending and its debt without major problems, with the new debt they create paying the old one, and so on. And if you're thinking this sounds a bit like a Ponzi scheme, you're not the only one who has made that association. If the interest on our debt cannot be covered by taxes, we basically become a Ponzi scheme. Michael Burry. And in a letter sent to Congress on January 13th, the current Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen said that the debt limit of $31.4 trillion would be reached on January 19th, and the Treasury would begin to take temporary measures such as the suspension of contributions to the retirement and disability funds of the Civil Service and the Health Benefits Fund for retirees of the Postal Service. But estimating that in June the Treasury funds would run out if new debt is not issued, and the country would default. Yellen also warns in her letter that the lack of speed in increasing the debt ceiling has already caused problems before, such as the reduction of the credit rating that was made in 2011, when Standard & Poor's considered that it was not impossible for the United States to default on its debt payments. But if this happens, who would they default on? The $31.4 trillion, taking the distribution of the latest Treasury Department report as a reference, are divided as follows. 46% belongs to the Federal Reserve and U.S. government accounts, 24% to governments and foreign investors, 20% to private investors, and the remaining 10% to other types of investors. As for the 24% or $7.5 trillion that they owe to foreigners, it is highly distributed among most countries in the world, with the top 5 being Japan with 3.5% of the total debt, China with 2.8%, the United Kingdom with 2.1%, Belgium with 1.1%, and Luxembourg with 1.1%. It is important to clarify that this debt does not give any of these countries power over the United States, only the right to receive the interest and principal of the debt at the agreed time. But what would happen if an agreement on the debt ceiling is not reached?
One time in Indiana, back in the 1890s, I think they passed a bill. I know it was introduced. You can look it up on a search engine. They passed a bill to change the value of pi, the mathematical term pi, to an even 3, because they said it would be easier for the school children to work with. Well, that's the only bill I can think of that would give competition to a refusal to raise the debt ceiling. I mean,
Although this scenario is unthinkable because it would be very stupid not to increase the debt ceiling to buy time and look for long-term structural solutions, it is possible to speculate a bit about it. First, there would be a huge sell-off on bonds. The yields or interest they pay would skyrocket, and all new government debt issued would have to pay much higher interest rates. The interest on any type of loan would increase considerably, and this would reduce the demand and income of companies. The financial costs would increase, and since it would not be advisable to refinance debts, there would be a general deleveraging of the economy, and of course this would trigger sharp falls in the stock market. In some ways, it would have a very similar effect, although obviously much worse, to what would happen if the Federal Reserve radically increased interest rates. And as happened in the early 1980s, it would make the country enter a deep economic recession. On the other hand, there would be permanent damage to confidence in the United States, and the loss of the dollar's reserve currency status would be among the possibilities. And this scenario would be so damaging to the United States economy that when finding themselves in a situation similar to Biden's, other presidents have sought legal alternatives to avoid a default, although with possible solutions being expensive or of dubious legal validity, such as the minting of $1 trillion platinum coin by the Treasury to be deposited in the Federal Reserve, and that amount of money released by the Fed so that it can be spent by the Treasury to meet its commitments. That obviously would damage the trust in the institutional framework of this country and would solve one problem by causing another. That is why the only real solution is to increase the debt ceiling, as is usually the case. However, this is a short-term solution. In the long term, the problem persists, but since it is silent, it is often not given enough attention. If the debt continues to rise, more and more of this country's spending will go to paying interest, creating more deficits and forcing them to borrow more and more money, creating a vicious cycle. In addition, if there are no structural changes, the interest will reach the point of representing a greater expense than Social Security, defense, education, or infrastructure, making future generations pay taxes to cover the interest on the debts that current generations are acquiring.
The thing about rising levels of debt is, unless there's some kind of financial crisis, you don't feel it moment to moment. It has a sort of a gradual eroding effect. It means that an increasing share of our budget is going to interest instead of into investments or lower taxes. It means that we get less private investment, which means less growth and lower income. Again, you won't feel this year over year. The Congressional Budget Office basically thinks that our debt is eroding economic growth by about 0.2% per year. That's no big deal over 1 year or 2 years or 3 years, but it starts to become a very large deal over 1 or 2 or 3 decades.
And it is worth clarifying that an increase in debt is not bad if the economy grows at a greater or equal rate, but this has not been the case in the United States, where debt, as a percentage of the economy, has been increasing during the last decades. A problem that, if not addressed, will explode, leaving enormous consequences for our economy. If you found this video helpful, you will probably enjoy this one too. See you next time.